The camera finds the image before the narration does. A photograph. Old, slightly overexposed, the colors washed out the way photographs from the mid-90s wash out when they've been stored in a cardboard box in a cold house for nearly 3 decades. 11 children, ages ranging from 7 to 12. They are standing in front of a school bus, a yellow school bus with a cracked side mirror and a dent above the rear wheel well. The children are dressed in heavy winter gear, parkas, snow pants, mittens on strings. Some of them are smiling. One boy in the back row is making a face at the camera. A girl in the front is looking slightly off to the side, as if she heard something just as the shutter clicked. Behind them, past the bus, past the flat frozen ground, there is nothing but white. White ground, white sky, white distance stretching out until it erases itself. The narration begins quietly, almost reluctantly, as if the speaker has told this story 100 times and it has never once gotten easier. There are places in Alaska where the land doesn't give things back, where something can go into the wilderness and the wilderness simply closes around it, like water closing over a stone. No ripple, no mark, just absence, a pause. On March 14th, 1997, 11 children and their teacher boarded a school bus outside the village of Chistochina, Alaska. They were going on a day trip, a nature walk, part of a science curriculum unit on winter ecology. The bus was supposed to travel 4 miles down the Tok Cutoff highway and park at a marked turnout near Gravel Creek. The walk was supposed to take 2 hours. Everyone was supposed to be home before dark. Another pause. Longer this time. None of them came back. Chistochina sits at the edge of the Copper River Basin, roughly 200 miles northeast of Anchorage, at the junction of the Glen Highway and the Tok Cutoff. It is not a large place. It has never been a large place. In 1997, the population was under 100 people, most of them Ahtna Athabascan, many of them related to one another through bloodlines that stretch back centuries across this particular piece of ground. There was a community hall, there was a small clinic, there was a post office that was also, some days, a general store, and there was a school, a 2-room building with a wood-burning stove, and a single teacher who handled all grades from kindergarten through 8th. That teacher was a woman named Deborah Wren. She was 34 years old in 1997. She had come to Chistochina 3 years earlier through a rural teacher placement program, arriving in August with 2 duffel bags, a box of books, and an earnest, slightly naive belief that the most meaningful teaching happened in the places most people overlooked. By the accounts of everyone who knew her, she had been right. She had learned words in Ahtna. She had attended the potlatches and the fish camps. She had built something real with the community, and the community had let her in, which, in a place like Chistochina, in an era like that one, meant something. The narration describes her carefully, not sentimentally, just accurately. Deborah Wren was not a reckless person. Everyone who knew her says the same thing. Not in the defensive way people say it about someone after something goes wrong, but matter-of-factly, the way you describe the weather. She was careful. She was prepared. She kept a first aid kit in the bus. She had emergency contact cards for every child. She had filed her trip plan with the school district the previous week. She had called the state weather line the morning of the trip and confirmed conditions were stable. She did everything right. The 11 children are introduced one by one. The camera lingers on the photograph. Close-ups of individual faces, names in the narration, brief descriptions that bring them briefly, painfully into focus. Margaret Tyone, 11 years old. The oldest in the group, a quiet boy who liked to draw maps of places he'd never been. Adeline's second chief, 9. Her mother would later say she had eaten 2 bowls of oatmeal that morning because she was excited about the snow. James Pete Jr., 8, called Jimmy by everyone, had lost 2 front teeth the week before and was deeply proud of the gap. Rosalie Sam, 10, the girl in the photograph who is looking slightly off to the side. Thomas and Daniel Tyone, 7-year-old twins, Marcus's younger brothers. They are standing at opposite ends of the back row, which their mother later said was typical. They always stood apart in photographs because they thought it was funny. Clara Esau, 12, the oldest girl, reading 3 grade levels above her age. Owen Shaganoff, 9, had a habit of collecting smooth stones and keeping them in his coat pockets. Nadia Boskovsky, 8, the only child in the group who was not from the village. Her family had moved to Chistochina the previous fall from Glenallen. Samuel Ewan, 10, Deborah Wren's best student at mathematics. And finally, Lucy Tyone, 6, the youngest, Marcus, Thomas, and Daniel's little sister. She had been added to the trip at the last minute because the woman who usually watched her on school days had gone to Anchorage for a medical appointment. Deborah Wren had said it was fine. Of course it was fine. 12 people got on that bus at 9:17 in the morning. The driver was a part-time employee of the school district named Roy Esau, Clara's uncle. He dropped them at the Gravel Creek turnout, watched them walk into the tree line, and drove back to the village to wait. He was supposed to pick them up at 1:30 in the afternoon. At 1:30, he drove back to the turnout. The bus tracks were still there in the snow. Deborah Wren's boot prints were still there, leading away from the road and into the trees. The children's footprints were still there, but there was no one to pick up. The search began within hours. Roy Esau drove back to the village and raised the alarm, and by 3 in the afternoon, with the sun already low and dropping toward the horizon in that particular Alaskan way that feels like a door closing, the first search teams were moving into the forest beyond the Gravel Creek turnout. What they found in the first hours was enough to sustain hope, and not enough to explain anything. The footprints continued into the forest for approximately half a mile. They showed the group moving together, in a loose cluster, the way a class of children moves when they are following a teacher, and being reasonably good about it. Then, at a point where the forest opened slightly around a frozen creek bed, the tracks became complicated. They spread out, the way tracks spread out when a group of people stops and disperses to look at something. Several sets of child-sized prints moved toward the creek bank. Deborah Wren's prints were at the center. And then, quite simply, the tracks stopped. Not gradually, not in a way that suggested the group had split up or turned back or continued in a different direction. The tracks stopped as if the people making them had ceased to exist at a particular point in space. The snow beyond the last set of prints was undisturbed. There were no signs of a struggle. There were no signs that anyone had turned back. There were no drag marks, no blood, no broken branches, no evidence of any kind of violence or accident or sudden natural event. There were simply footprints, and then there were not. The Alaska State Troopers arrived the following morning. The FBI field office in Anchorage sent a team within 48 hours. A volunteer search involving over 200 people combed a 30-square-mile area over the following 2 weeks. Helicopters flew grid patterns over the Copper River Basin. Dogs were brought in from Fairbanks and from Juneau. A diver searched the creek bed where the tracks ended, working in water so cold that each dive lasted less than 4 minutes. Nothing. The investigation churned for months. Theories accumulated the way debris accumulates in a river. Not neatly, not usefully, but in great tangled heaps that made the actual shape of the channel harder, not easier, to see. There was a theory about a hidden sinkhole, a collapse of the frozen ground into an underground drainage system that could have taken everyone at once. Geological surveys found no evidence of this. There was a theory about foul play, a predator, a vehicle that had approached through the trees from a different direction, a person or persons who had orchestrated something planned and terrible. This theory required explaining how 12 people, including 11 children, had been taken with no sign of struggle, no sound heard by anyone within range, and no tracks other than their own. There was a theory, whispered rather than stated formally, the kind of theory that appears in the margins of official documents as a bracketed note, that the group had somehow become disoriented and crossed the frozen surface of a pond or a section of the Copper River and gone through. This required ignoring the fact that no open water was accessible from the point where the tracks ended, and that the tracks themselves showed no movement in that direction. There was, in the community of Chistochina, another kind of explanation, one that predated the investigation, predated the school, predated the road that ran through the village, a knowledge, carried in the Ahtna language and the Ahtna memory, that certain places in that landscape were places where the boundary between the ordinary world and something else was thin. That certain features of the land, a particular bend in a creek, a stand of black spruce arranged in a pattern that didn't match the wind, a place where the animals never went, were markers, warnings. The elders spoke about this quietly and did not press it on the investigators, because they knew how it would be received, and because the grief was too large for arguments about who would believe what. The investigation was officially moved to inactive status in April of 2002, 5 years after the disappearance. No remains were ever found. No conclusive explanation was ever established. The case file runs to over 4,000 pages. In those 4,000 pages, there is not a single piece of physical evidence that explains what happened to Deborah Wren and 11 children between the tree line at Gravel Creek and the frozen afternoon they walked into. The years pass. The camera shows them passing not through montage but through the slow accumulation of grief in a small place. The village grows quieter. Families leave. Some stay. The school building is still used. There are always children in Chistochina. There are always children who need teaching. But the room where Deborah Wren hung her students' drawings on the walls with pushpins is repainted a different color now. And the pushpin holes are plastered over, and the drawings are gone. 3 of the missing children's mothers remain in the village through all 27 years. The others scatter to Glenallen, to Anchorage, to places where the specific weight of that particular silence is not on every wall and every window. One mother does not scatter. One mother does not move at all. Her name is Margaret Tyone. She lost 4 children on March 14, 1997. Marcus, Thomas, Daniel, and Lucy, all 4 of her children. She was 31 years old when it happened. She is 58 now. She has lived in the same house on the same road in Chistochina for all 27 years since. She has kept every piece of paper the investigators ever gave her. She has read the 4,000-page case file 3 times. She has a room in her house, the smallest bedroom, the one that used to be Lucy's, where the boxes are stacked floor to ceiling. She has never stopped. "I know what people think," she says in the interview, her voice steady in a way that has clearly been built and maintained through an enormous act of will over a very long time. "They think I'm still looking because I can't accept it, because I need something to hold on to." Maybe that's true, but I also know something that the investigators never quite figured out. I know these children. I know this land. And I know that the answer was always in the photograph. The photograph has existed since the morning of March 14, 1997. It was taken by Roy Esau on a disposable camera he kept in the bus's glove compartment, the kind of camera that came in a cardboard box and cost $8 at the pharmacy in Glenallen. He had snapped it on an impulse, the way people sometimes do before a departure, when something in the moment suggests that a moment should be kept. He had not thought much about it. He developed the roll of film in the weeks after the disappearance because the investigators asked him to develop everything, any photograph from anywhere near that time period. He handed the developed prints to the investigators. They scanned them, noted them, filed them. Margaret Tyone received a copy of the photograph, a standard 4x6 print, in a manila envelope from the FBI field office sometime in 1998. She looked at it the way she looked at everything from that period, searching it for something, anything, that didn't belong, that was out of place, that might be a thread worth pulling. She found nothing. She put it in a plastic sleeve and put the plastic sleeve in a 3-ring binder and put the binder in the room with the boxes. For 26 years, she looked at the photograph periodically, every few months, sometimes more often. She knew every face in it by heart. She could close her eyes and see it, the order the children were standing in, the cracked mirror on the bus, the white distance behind them. She never saw it. And then, in January of 2024, her niece, a woman in her mid-30s named Sandra Tyone, who lives in Anchorage and works as a medical records administrator, came to visit. Sandra had not seen the photograph in years. She asked to look at it. Margaret took it out of the binder and handed it across the kitchen table. Sandra looked at it for about 30 seconds, and then she said, "Auntie, who is that?" She was pointing to the tree line in the background of the photograph, behind the bus, beyond the flat frozen ground, at the edge of the forest, where the white ground met the dark line of the black spruce. Margaret had looked at the background of the photograph many times. She had always registered it as empty, the white ground, the sky, the trees, nothing. But Sandra was pointing at something at the edge of the tree line, something Margaret had always interpreted, in all her years of looking, as a tree. A particularly upright black spruce at the border of the forest, slightly set apart from the others, slightly lighter in tone than the trees beside it. It was not a tree. It was a person, standing at the edge of the forest, partially obscured by a spruce branch in the foreground, dressed in white or very light gray, which was why, against the winter background, against the snow and the pale sky, against 27 years of looking without seeing, Margaret Tyone had never noticed a person standing at the tree line, watching the children board the bus. "I've looked at that photograph 10,000 times, Margaret says in the interview. Her voice does not break, but something behind it does. Something tectonic, deep, the way bedrock shifts. 10,000 times, and I never saw it, because I was always looking at the children. I was always looking at their faces. I never looked at the background." Sandra saw it in 3 seconds. The photograph is sent to the FBI's digital forensics lab in Quantico. The image is enhanced. The figure in the tree line becomes clearer. Not perfectly clear, because the original is a 30-year-old 4x6 print from a disposable camera, and digital enhancement has limits, but clear enough. The figure is an adult, that much is certain. The height relative to the trees places the figure at somewhere between 5'8" and 6'2". The clothing appears to be a light-colored parka or anorak, possibly white, possibly very light gray or cream, with a hood. The hood is up. The face is not visible. The figure is standing still, facing the direction of the bus and the children. There is no vehicle visible near the figure. There is no obvious point of approach, no tracks leading to where the figure is standing, though the forensic analysts note that the resolution of the original photograph does not allow them to rule out the presence of tracks. The figure was not interviewed at the time. The figure was not identified at the time. The figure was never noticed at the time by anyone, not by Roy Esau, who took the photograph, not by the investigators who scanned it, not by the forensic analysts who noted it in the case file along with everything else, because everyone, like Margaret, had been looking at the children. The FBI reopened the case in February of 2024. They are currently pursuing new investigative leads based on the identification of the unidentified individual in the photograph. Margaret Tyone was notified of the reopening by phone. She says the agent who called her was a young woman who sounded like she was trying to hold herself together. Margaret said, "Take your time. I've waited 27 years. I can wait a little longer." The re-examination of the photograph changes everything and clarifies nothing. Not yet, but it fractures the settled, petrified certainty of an inactive case file and lets light in through the cracks. The digital forensics team works on the image for 6 weeks. They are looking for anything that can help identify the figure, patterns in the clothing, any visible equipment, anything that might establish a connection to a known individual or a known vehicle type or a known movement through the Tok Cutoff corridor on March 14, 1997. What they find is this. In the extreme upper corner of the photograph, above and to the left of the figure in the tree line, there is what appears to be the roof line of a vehicle, barely visible. Almost certainly not something anyone would consciously register as a vehicle roof. It was always there in the photograph. It was always noted in the case file inventory as possible artifact or debris at frame edge. And in 27 years, no one had revisited that interpretation. It is not an artifact. It is not debris. It is the upper edge of a light-colored vehicle. The analysts believe it is most likely a pickup truck or a large SUV, parked on a path or a service road that runs along the tree line, out of the main sight line of the bus turnout. This matters enormously because one of the foundational pillars of the original investigation, one of the reasons the foul play theory had always seemed structurally difficult, was the absence of any vehicle at the scene. Roy Esau had not seen any other vehicles at the turnout. The tire tracks in the snow at the turnout belonged to the bus, and to Roy Esau's return trip, and to nothing else. But the turnout and the service road along the tree line are two different places. The service road, a rough track used by the Alaska Department of Transportation for maintenance access, was checked during the original investigation. But the snow on it on March 14th had been disturbed enough by prior maintenance use that individual tire tracks could not be isolated. It had been noted and moved on from. A vehicle on that service road on that morning with a person watching from the tree line. The FBI is not releasing details of specific investigative leads at this time. What is known publicly is that the case is active, that new forensic analysis is ongoing, and that investigators are seeking information from anyone who may have been on or near the Tok Cutoff Highway between mile markers 34 and 41 on March 14, 1997. In Chistochina, the The news of the reopening moves through the village the way news always moves through small places, quickly, quietly, and with an emotional weight that the people carrying it have been trained by decades of grief to manage in front of others and deal with alone. The three mothers who stayed are each visited by the investigators separately. Each of them is shown the enhanced photograph. Each of them is asked if the figure in the tree line is recognizable. Two of them say no. Margaret Tyone looks at the photograph for a very long time, long enough that the agent sitting across her kitchen table is not sure what to do with the silence, long enough that the sound of the wood stove becomes the loudest thing in the room. Then she says, "I need to think about something." She does not say what she needs to think about. She asks the agent to leave the enhanced photograph with her. The agent leaves a copy. 3 days later, Margaret calls the FBI field office in Anchorage. She asks to speak to the agent in charge of the case. When the agent answers, Margaret says, "I think I know who that is." What Margaret Tyone noticed, what she spent 3 days thinking about before she said anything, was not the figure itself. It was the clothing. Specifically, it was the collar of the parka, a particular style of collar, a double-stitched standing collar with a distinct folded-over upper edge that she recognized, not from the newspapers, not from the investigation files, from a coat she had seen hanging on a hook in a particular entryway in a particular house in Chistochina every time she had visited that house during the year before the disappearance. The house belonged to a man named Edwin Carlin. Edwin Carlin was not from Chistochina. He had arrived in the village approximately 14 months before the disappearance, in January of 1996, presenting himself as a wildlife biologist conducting independent research on moose migration patterns in the Copper River Basin. He rented a small cabin on the north edge of the village from an elderly resident named George Shaganoff, Owen Shaganoff's grandfather. He was quiet, polite, and largely kept to himself. He attended a few community events. He occasionally helped George Shaganoff with firewood. He left Chistochina in late February of 1997, approximately 2 weeks before the disappearance. At the time, his departure was noted and not thought much of. Field researchers came and went. He had mentioned in conversations with several village residents that his research season was wrapping up and that he planned to return to the lower 48. The original investigation had identified Edwin Carlin as a person of interest in the early stages of the inquiry, along with several other individuals who had been in or near the village in the months before the disappearance. He had been interviewed by phone. He had provided an account of his whereabouts on March 14th. He was, he said, already in Seattle by that date. He had provided documentation supporting this, a hotel receipt, a credit card statement. The documentation had been checked and had not been found to be false. Edwin Carlin had been moved from the active persons of interest list, but he had never fully disappeared from Margaret's mind. There was something about him, she says. I couldn't tell you what it was back then. I didn't have a word for it. He was always friendly, always helpful. He never did anything you could point to. But there was something, the way he looked at the children. Not wrong exactly, just too careful. The way someone looks at something they are trying very hard not to look at. She had mentioned this to investigators in 1997. It was noted. It was weighed against the documented alibi and the absence of any physical evidence connecting Carlin to the scene. It was filed. The detail of the collar changes everything. The FBI's investigation, as of the time this documentary was produced, has established the following. Edwin Carlin's real name is not Edwin Carlin. The identity was constructed using documentation from a deceased individual, a real Edwin Carlin who died in a car accident in Oregon in 1989. The social security number, the driver's license, the research credentials, all of it was built on that foundation, carefully and with knowledge of how to do so. The man who called himself Edwin Carlin has not been publicly identified. The FBI has stated that they have a person of interest they are actively seeking and that the investigation is at a sensitive stage. The hotel receipt from Seattle, the alibi documentation from March 14, 1997, has been re-examined in light of the new forensic evidence. The hotel exists. The receipt is real. But the check-in date was March 13th. The checkout date was March 16th. The hotel is in Seattle. The distance from Seattle to the Tok Cutoff Highway near Chistochina, Alaska, is approximately 2,200 miles. But there are flights. There were flights in 1997. A flight from Seattle to Anchorage took just over 3 hours. The drive from Anchorage to the Tok Cutoff, near Chistochina, took approximately 4 hours, depending on conditions. It was possible. It had always been possible. No one had looked at the hotel receipt and calculated the drive time, because no one had ever placed the man called Edwin Carlin within range of the scene. No one had ever had a reason to, until Margaret Tyone spent 3 days looking at a folded-over collar. She's been looking at everything in that case file for 27 years, Sandra Tyone says in her interview, speaking quietly, her hands folded on the table. Everyone always says she can't let go, but that's not it. She was looking at it differently than the investigators were looking at it. She was looking at it the way a mother looks. You notice different things when you're looking for your children. The investigation is active. That is what is known. The 11 children and Deborah Wren have not been found. After 27 years, the legal presumption of death has long been established for all of them. But Margaret Tyone does not use that language. She says they have not been found. She says it clearly, without argument, as a simple statement of fact. They have not been found. The Gravel Creek turnout on the Tok Cutoff Highway is still there. The service road along the tree line is still there, though it is heavily overgrown now and not easily visible from the highway. The black spruce forest that the children walked into on the morning of March 14, 1997 is still there. It looks the same as it did then, because black spruce in interior Alaska looks the same across decades. The slow growth of cold ground changing the trees so gradually that a photograph from 27 years ago and a photograph taken today are almost indistinguishable. The school building in Chistochina is still used. There are children there. There are always children. Margaret Tyone's house is the same house. The boxes are still in the room that used to be Lucy's room, but there is space now. Space that wasn't there before January of 2024, because some of the boxes have been moved to the kitchen table where she has been working, going back through things, looking at things she has already looked at 10,000 times, with the new knowledge that something she once saw as a tree was a person, and that something she once saw as a credential was a lie, and that somewhere in those 4,000 pages, there may be other details that have been sitting in plain sight for 27 years, waiting for someone to look at them with the right kind of attention. Do you think they'll find him? The interviewer asks. Margaret Tyone looks out the window of her kitchen. Outside, it is winter. Outside, the land is white. The same white it was in the photograph. The same white it was on the morning that everything changed. There is a stand of black spruce at the edge of her property, dark against the pale sky. She looks at the trees for a moment. I think, she says slowly, that he has been findable for 27 years. I think all of it has been findable. I think the answer has been sitting in that photograph since 1997. We just needed someone who didn't already know what she was looking at. A long pause. The wood stove ticks. Outside, snow begins to fall. Not dramatically, not cinematically, just quietly, the way snow falls in interior Alaska, without announcement, without urgency, as if it has been falling forever and will continue to do so long after everything else is settled or unsettled or lost or found. Sandra saw it in 30 seconds, Margaret says again. 30 seconds. She says it without bitterness and without wonder. She says it the way you say a fact that has changed everything and continues in the changed world to simply be true. The camera holds on her face for a long moment. Then it finds the window and the trees and the falling snow. Then it finds nothing, just white, just the land, just the distance that stretches out until it erases itself, the way it always has, the way it always will.
11 children, 1 teacher, 1 photograph, 27 years, and a mother who never stopped looking